In this video, you will observe how to deploy a passive air sampler for gaseous mercury monitoring. Preparing the sampler. This is the sampler. First, remove the storage lid. Store caps for the retrieval procedure. A mesh lid for sampling needs to be installed instead. To prepare the mesh lid, hold the mesh concave down and insert it into the lid. The mesh lid can now be screwed on and be tightened. The sampler is now ready to deploy. Use one of three methods to deploy the sampler, depending on whether you have available a vertical surface, a horizontal surface, or a mesh fence. To deploy the sampler on a vertical surface, you will need the sampler and two cable ties. First, put the sampler at the appropriate height. Next, tighten the bottom cable tie, positioning the sampler. Tighten the second cable tie. Finally, make sure both cable ties are tight so the sampler does not move under strong winds. Take note of the date and time. To deploy the sampler on a horizontal surface, you will need two cable ties, a sampler, a hose clamp, and a nut driver. First, fasten the hose clamp around the structure, tightening with the nut driver until there is only a little space around the structure. If you do not have a hose clamp, secure a cable tie around the horizontal structure instead. Next, thread a cable tie through the hose clamp and tighten around the bottom of the sampler. Thread the second cable tie through the hose clamp and tighten around the top of the sampler. The bottom of the sampler should be level with the ground. Finally, tighten the hose clamp around the horizontal structure. Make sure both cable ties are tight so the sampler does not move under strong winds. Take note of the date and time. To deploy the sampler on a mesh fence, you will need two cable ties and a sampler. First, tighten the cable tie around one link in the mesh fence and the top of the sampler. Next, tighten the cable tie around two links in the mesh fence and the bottom of the sampler, parallel to the ground. Finally, make sure both cable ties are tight so the sampler does not move under strong winds. Take note of the date and time. To retrieve the sampler, first cut it loose by cutting the cable ties. Be careful not to damage the blue housing. The next part of the procedure is just like the sampler preparation procedure, but backwards. We will replace the mesh lid with the storage lid. Remove the mesh lid. Now, screw on a storage lid and tighten the lid extremely tight. Wrap Teflon tape twice around the top of the sampler between the cap and the jar and press down the end firmly. The sampler is now ready to label. Label both the side of the blue housing and the storage lid, writing the location, the date deployed and date collected, and the time deployed and time collected. Put the sampler in 2 layers of Ziploc bags. Troubleshooting. Use gloves. If you find that the inner white cylinder has become detached, turn the sampler upside down and remove the lid. Only handle the cylinder by the blue end. Apply crazy glue to the cylinder at this end and attach back inside the housing here. Once you've replaced the lid, the sampler is ready to be redeployed.